Hello, my name is Miguel Resendiz. I'm a marketing professional, entrepreneur, and the host of this podcast, Midcast, a program where we discuss how to monetize your talent, ideas, and show examples of people who have successfully done so in the past. In this podcast, we aim to bring the best business and life insights to help you materialize your goals. An open mind will go a long way in this program, so fasten your seatbelts and get ready for the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to one of your favorite podcasts, Midcast. Today, I have the pleasure to talk to Chris Terrs. He is the co-founder of salesprimer.ca and also a business coach. I met him as a business coach in Venture Labs and Venture Connections at SFU, and he inspired me to get more into the technical aspects of marketing and try to cross-function finances with marketing. So, how are you, Chris?
I'm doing great, Miguel. Thanks for having me today.
Well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate your time commitment, and honestly, the notes that you made were very organized, and it just speaks to the mission that you have of teaching. You know what you have learned so far, and that's why I wanted to have you here. You're a very well spoken, and very knowledgeable person in the business world in general. So you are the co-founder of Sales Primer, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how does that work? Tell us a little bit about it, and where did that come from, and where is it now?
So thanks for that, Miguel. Yeah, salesprimer.ca is actually newly launched, and it's coming out of about 6 years of consulting with early stage startups. Salesprimer.ca is actually a very simple software application, along with a consulting practice that my co-founder Colin McQuinney and I established, and it's meant to help first-time entrepreneurs and early-stage founders to really understand what it takes to build a repeatable sales engine behind their innovation, technology, or startup.
Okay, so that sounds. I mean, that sounds incredibly good. So Colin is he was also at Venture Connections. Am I correct?
Colin has done, he's done a lot of work in the Vancouver market, helping early stage startups. He's been a guest lecturer in the SFU circuit, teaches at BCIT, has founded his own practice going on about 20 years now, canadastartup.com. And he and I have been working as a team for, easily 7 years.
Okay.
And again, Sales Primer is sort of what's come out of our experiencing in helping early stage entrepreneurs really overcoming their fear of numbers. One of the things we've discovered is there's a lot of great sort of literature on the softer skills as it relates to building a company, launching an innovation into the market. But we find it's curious. We find many entrepreneurs really tend to shy away from some of the harder topics, and probably the most difficult topic for many is taking a close look at what we say their numbers. And usually that's about their sales model and how they're going to generate revenue with their innovation, and then their financial model, and translating that into a tool like a pro forma that you would take to investors to help raise funds.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what Colin and I have been working on over the years is finding ways to simplify and systemize your approach to your sales engine and to your financial modeling, and to help people get over that initial fear and intimidation.
I see. When I have been reading about startups and businesses in general because I'm pretty interested on that. And I mean, in this podcast, I have talked to a few as well. So the main question when you talk about the numbers, there's a lot of emphasis in numbers a lot of the times too, and I think that can lead to maybe over focusing on features in the product and focusing maybe on the hard skills as well. And I think it is, or not hard skills, but like on this analytical part of the business. There in a startup when they're smaller, I think there needs to be a balance between someone that's trying to keep the 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 team dynamics afloat, and then someone that's trying to keep the business or the analytical part in check, right? So how do I mean, first of all, how do you think a student who wants to start his own business, his or her own business, how do you think they should come about it? Like when they're finding their first partner, or like when they're planning on launching their product, how should that process be from the beginning?
It's a great question, and to be honest with you, Miguel, I mean the irony is the more years I spend in this space, the more I realize that um, there's a lot of different ways in which startups and innovations evolve. There is no one single kind of primer or template for success. And as we all know, they often say 50% of it is sheer good fortune, a matter of timing or just the right circumstances. But I think the very first most important thing you would need to do, whether working alone or most especially as you start to build a team, is make absolutely certain you have built or developed something or are in the process of creating something that an audience really wants to buy. They not only want it, they're willing to pay money. And we often talk about that as that early customer discovery. And there's many entrepreneurs I've run into who even make the mistake of trying to build out something too early. And often, some of the greater innovations that we're seeing in the market are being developed by engineers, technologists, software coders. And of course, they're built and trained to be, very sophisticated builders. That's their instinct. That's what they try to do. But the reality is that the better approach is to say, look, I've got an idea, I've got a concept, but let me actually just sit down with some human beings that I think represent my target market and make sure I'm on the right track, and make sure that they're really getting excited about what it is I'm developing, and that it's directly either addressing a problem or a real appetite that they have. And that's absolutely the first step that you need to take. And it doesn't take too many conversations to get there. There was a quote that I heard one entrepreneur tell me at one point in time, said, you've got something because you suddenly feel like you're getting picked up in a tornado. And the conversations you have, and usually whatever your target market is, I mean, it can be as few as 10 conversations with people you think represent your target market. And you're not just looking for people to say, hey, yeah, that kind of sounds interesting. Yeah, I might look at that when you get it developed a little bit further. It usually what you find, and I've been through it myself, is if you're really onto something, people almost jump across the table at you and say, if you could get this to me yesterday, you would save me so much trouble, or I would buy 10 units of those tomorrow if you could make them available to me. It's that kind of exuberant language you're looking for. And that's really the first step before you look at anything else, including the numbers. You're absolutely right. You need to start off by just saying, do I have the right product market fit? And am I doing an adequate amount of customer discovery to make me feel comfortable that I've actually got something here? That's really step one.
Yeah. So I mean, in school they often teach us that we need to look at the user journey and at the user personas, and it is really interesting to see that basically this is what it translates to. You need to see who your ideal customer is, and then center it center it at, at the middle of the segment, basically, because one of the things we look in theory was that you will never have like a bunch of people that fit your persona, but there will be people that will share characteristics with that persona. So these characteristics basically are predictors of purchasing. And once I looked at this, then I kind of realized why the current fintech industry is so successful, because the fintech industry is oftentimes funded by people that, I mean, they're just people that need to solve problems for themselves. We have an example with Lumenwire. These are people that were that had a problem themselves, right? And then they understood the journey. Then they will be customers themselves of that company, right? And everybody they spoke to about this, everybody wanted it. So We have other fintech companies in the world like Mocha and TransferWise, where these companies were funded by people that had issues, and they just said like, okay, I'm tired of this. I'm just gonna fix it. And I think I think a lot of these people don't really know that they need to focus on the customer, but since they are so close to the customer, basically they are the customer. I think they're very successful at implementing these new startups.
Well, and Miguel, that's a really good place to start. For many, if you're really fortunate, and probably one of the strongest positions to start with as an entrepreneur and innovator, is that if you actually set out to solve a problem for your own sake and you came up with a solution, somebody who's wired to be an entrepreneur, usually the very next question they ask themselves is they say, well, wait a minute, this worked for me, but how many other people are out there just like me who are dealing with the exact same problem? And, and once you start looking at that question, I mean, if it turns out you have a very unique problem and you're in a particularly unique situation, well, then in reality, you may have just created a solution that's very specific to your own situation. On the other hand, you may determine, and Lumenwire, of course, which I know well, is an example where, well, in actual fact, it was about, delivering online financial services for the international Persian community and very unique challenges. And, these handful of students who first founded the company started to realize, well, wait a minute, there's tens of thousands of us worldwide who are probably struggling with the exact same situation. And they knew for a fact there wasn't another solution out there that could do quite exactly what Lumenwire did. Well, now there's the potential for what we refer to as repeatability and scalability. So if you come from that place yourself, if you're ultimately addressing a problem that you yourself are facing day to day, then that is the next natural question to ask, is to say, wait a minute, how many more of me are there out there? And if you start to realize it could be a big number, then that begins to tell you there could be an opportunity. But even still, you want to start going out and talking to 10 or 12 or 15 other people to say, hey, here's my crazy idea. Does it work for you too? And that's all part of those beginning steps in your customer journey.
There was a book that one of my professors recommended, where I'm gonna mention the name later of the book because I don't have it on top of my mind. But basically, this book talk about user discovery, and how it works is, go talk to people that you don't know, because all your friends will tell you, yes, I will buy that, or yeah, that sounds really cool, or you'll be with a group of people that they just don't want to hurt you, right? Even if your idea is shit. That's why we see a lot of people joining pyramid schemes. They just are afraid of insulting or offending their friends or their family members.
Really, absolutely, really good points. Yeah, I mean, it usually starts with you talking to a couple of colleagues that you might know, because it's, everyone's time is super busy. And if you genuinely need a good 20, 30 minutes, maybe even an hour to have a deep dive conversation about what it is you're trying to do and achieve, and the problem you're trying to address, initially it's a bit difficult to just cold call a stranger. First off, you may need to practice a little bit what it is you're saying, and you got to start to script the right kind of questions to be asking. So sometimes it does start off by going to a warmer colleague, but you're absolutely right. There is a point at which you need to completely stop that, and you need to switch gears and go to an absolute stranger. That's going to be the real test as to whether you're onto something, because now it's about being as efficient and as respectful with that person's time as you can be, which means you kind of got to get straight to the point and say, look, this is the problem I think is out there. Do you have the same problem? If so, this is the solution. What do you think? Is this better than anything else you're dealing with right now? Hopefully they say yes. Then you say, well, to what order of magnitude? And they might say, well, geez, this is 10 times better than what I'm currently doing right now. And if they start telling you something like that, then you have an opportunity to generate revenue with this idea. But you're right. You ultimately need to switch gears and start talking to strangers. Miguel, one thing I'd add, though, you mentioned different books. I mean, one of the books I was a real eye opener for me. I'm constantly trying to research new and better practices. And one of the great books I read was Sprint by Jake Knapp, who worked for many years at Google Ventures. And it's a fantastic book on customer discovery and early stage product iteration. And certainly he messages again, he says, look, when you're prototyping, you don't necessarily need to build out something overly complex. Number one, just do a rough sort of prototype. If you do even need a visual to put in front of an audience. And secondly, he found, after literally working with hundreds of startups and their customer discovery process, he found that you know whether you're on the right track with as few as 5 conversations talking to absolute strangers. And the math is pretty simple. If 3 out of 5 seem to get lit up and excited about what it is you're doing, well, then you're probably onto something. And then obviously you want to build upon that. But startups, as you well know, they don't have big budgets for in-depth qualitative market research. So you just got to start off taking those simple steps and talking to 5, maybe 7, maybe 10, and you'll know pretty quick. You combine what Jake Knapp said with that tornado effect. If you sit down with somebody and in a matter of 20 minutes, you see a lot of it is about body language and emotional response. And if you see people really light up, and kind of jump across the table and say, geez, like I would be on top of this tomorrow if you can make it available. That's when you start to know, your instincts are starting to tell you, oh, I'm onto something. And then you begin that iterative journey and start fleshing out the hypothesis a little bit more and a little bit more, both as it relates to, are you really talking to the right target market? Because often it takes a little bit to determine what your beachhead is, but also as it relates to what your true product strength and value proposition are. Because even that typically changes. You kind of set out having those first 5 conversations on the customer journey, thinking you know what the strength of your solution is. But even that tends to alter a little bit. And so you want to allow those early stage would-be customers, you want to kind of put it in front of them, and then you want to be quiet and you want to let them tell you what it is they really value in it in their own language. And again, those are where you start getting the clues as to whether you're on the right track or not.
Yeah, I just remember the name actually of the book. You mentioned talking to strangers, so the book was Talking to Humans actually. So Talking to Humans by Give Constable, and yeah, it was a really good book, and I had it for a class, and it was a mandatory reading. But I think this just I think this is a mandatory read for anybody who's trying to start something, because it really talks about that, about the whole thing that you just described. And look, I think that's something that sometimes entrepreneurs are missing, just understanding their customers.
Miguel, I love the title of that book. Actually, that's fantastic. I should make sure I pick up a copy and read it. But it's funny because one of the notes I prepared for our conversation today was, in my mind, a critical part of success is not about understanding technology and understanding the different things in the world that we run to. It's all about understanding humans. At the end of this day, no matter what it is you're doing, somebody somewhere along the line needs to adopt it, and they need to pull out their checkbook and pay you for what it is you're doing. And that decision is driven by a human being. And more often than not, part of the decision they make is actually driven by emotional criteria. I mean, we quite often talk about things like, it's important when you start to model out who your ideal target persona is. We talk about the functional buyer, the end user. We talk about the economic buyer, the one who's cutting the check. We talk about the technical buyer, who's really kind of breaking down precisely how a particular solution or technology will fit in with the rest of their platform or environment. But again, the more years you've sold and marketed product and service, as I have, I mean, it's been a good 25 going on 30 years now that I've been a professional sales rep marketer, you realize at least 50% of the decision almost every time is driven by emotion at some point. And that's all about human beings. So the more you step back for a second and think about your audience and think about how a human being is going to respond emotionally and functionally and economically to what it is you're putting in front of them, in many ways, that's far more important than the nuts and bolts of your widget or gadget. So you're absolutely right, that all begins with customer discovery. As soon as you have an idea, don't get lost in the product and the features and functions. Don't start building away locked up in a science lab somewhere or cooped up in a closet. Like, get out there and start talking to people and make sure you're on the right track.
So we have right now touched on the person or the human side of the business, but it is equally important, I think, to understand your numbers. Learn your, as you will say, your cocktail napkin numbers, right? And
Right,
I think that comes from the fact that a lot of these businesses are usually pitched in a coffee shop or something, right? So you need to be able to do this in a napkin. That's quite interesting and quite funny. But so tell us, how would you begin to do that then? How would you begin to start analyzing your numbers as a young entrepreneur, right? Like I think a lot of people often freak out because it is really difficult to translate what they learn in school about finances or economics or any simple math to their business, because they just don't know how to analyze the data.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a dance, and it takes a while to sort of get it sorted out in your head. I think the first thing I'd recommend, and it's why I often talk to entrepreneurs about, just begin in the rough with those cocktail napkin numbers. Don't feel that you need to build out this comprehensive 5-year financial model. We often call it a pro forma, on a 10-tab spreadsheet. There's no need in jumping into that right away. Just look at the basic math behind your business. And this happens in terms of when you begin to do this. Again, we spent the beginning of this podcast talking about the importance of product market fit, that customer discovery journey that you need to go through. And really, as soon as you have a spark of inspiration and a bit of an idea about an innovation and a problem you're trying to solve, you get out there and you go through what we typically call market validation training, right? Which is set up a series of questions that you put forward to a small sample size of would-be customers. Once you get a sense that you may be onto something, then you might do a very lightweight prototype to provide further visual cues to your target personas to make sure you're on the right track. But at the very same time that you're doing market validation, you want to switch gears and you want to begin looking at what I call your financial viability. And it's really a two-part process. And again, it's very simple. The math in the beginning is very simple. The first thing I'm going to ask you is, do you understand your unit economics? And this is very much a term that angel investors, those first early investors, often look at and use. And Miguel, it's real simple. If you think you've got something that people are going to buy, do you know roughly how you're going to price it? And most importantly, how much profit you can make off a single sale or transaction? That is the most critical first step, because I can tell you there's no way you're going to be able to ever make a profitable company if you can't first and foremost determine whether you're making a profit off a single transaction. And that may sound really straightforward, but you'd be amazed at how many entrepreneurs I've worked with over the years who they get very excited about their idea, their concept. They may be doing all the right things as it relates to market validation. And then they start building things out. But they haven't taken a moment to step back and say, well, wait a minute, what are the costs associated with this business first and foremost? How am I going to price this roughly? Is there a comparable business out there that has a pricing model that sort of looks similar to what it is I might be able to do and to charge? In which case, how much gross margin am I making off a single transaction? And then that usually leads to the next question, is that if you understand how much money you're making off a single transaction, then the next thing I ask you is, okay, well, how many of those transactions, how much volume of business do you need to break even? because milestone number one is all about survival state. Like, do you clearly understand what it's going to take to, at the very least, get to a self-sustaining position where you're surviving, you're able to meet payroll, and you're able to keep your entire team in food and in rent. And so I often say it's learn to survive and then figure out how to thrive. But all of that begins with a very simple understanding of what your numbers might look like, and whether you have the potential to price what it is you're doing in a way that's going to make a reasonable profit, and get you to self-sustaining. Those are the first sort of few steps you need to take from a financial perspective.
That makes sense. A lot of the times, I mean, I see startups just hoping that sweat equity will be enough, right? But people need to eat and need to pay rent. So I think that's one of the hardest parts for startups, to just keep people afloat, right? Because if you don't maintain people living, I mean, it is really difficult to find people that will volunteer um, in this in your startup, unless they believe in the cause and they're like, yeah, like this is something I really want to help, you know, like activists do, right? They volunteer their time and they're incredibly passionate about it, and that's one way that you can do it. Build, but at the same time, this is a job, right? Most activists don't work 8 hours a day for their cause. They use some hours here and there, maybe their weekends. But yeah, another thing uh, that I was trying to get in here is how do people figure out their cost structure? Because I always hear that, or I have heard many times that investors prefer a variable cost structure than a fixed cost structure. So they prefer more variable costs for the company than fixed cost. And
Right.
I see the advantage of variable cost because it is able to keep the company afloat for a longer time, especially during crisis. But fixed cost is also can be also very cheap if you sell a lot, right? If you have, like, I don't know, your fixed cost, and then you manage to sell a lot and reach your market, or like the majority of your market, and have a very big competitive advantage, then that's also very promising. Which one would you go for startups, or like for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, Miguel, look, that's a great question. And again, I would sort of say, look, every startup, every innovation, every business idea, it's all very different, and it's all about context. I think at the end of the day, we start off with the question. Again, it goes all the way back to the beginning. Have we identified a problem, or maybe just a very large appetite? I mean, on the B2C side, when it comes to consumer goods and consumer consumption, quite often a lot of money is made not off addressing a problem. It's just off addressing mass volume appetite on the part of consumers. But whatever it is, whether you're solving a problem or whether you're appeasing people's appetites, the question is, do you have something that clearly has the potential to sell in volume and or be highly lucrative? After that, the business models behind all of these kind of innovations and solutions are all going to be very different, right? I mean, the first big one is it a digital product or is it a physical product? I mean, if you're selling software in the beginning, the costs and the risks associated with building out some software and then beginning to kind of test people's appetite and the market demand through a bit of a lightweight initial digital marketing and social media marketing engagement, along with some lightweight outreach sales effort. All things considered, there's relatively low risk and low costs associated with that. On the other hand, if you're manufacturing a physical device, there's going to be all sorts of upfront R&D costs associated with that. There'll be repeated prototyping. Then you need to get into manufacturing, and that's going to require acquisition of raw materials, warehousing of raw materials, warehousing of finished product. It's a much more complicated process with a lot more risk and a lot more cash requirements up front. But on the other hand, if we're talking about the manufacture of iPhones, or really popular devices. Well, the reality is, it's a huge market, and there's an opportunity to make real money. So I'll circle back by saying I don't think there's any right or wrong way. This question was kind of triggered by an observation that you had mentioned investors make, where investors prefer there to be in balance more variable costs than fixed costs. Well, it's natural for an investor to say that because in the world of investors, they want lower and lower risk and greater return. Like that's what everybody wants. That's the dream, completely eliminate risk and increase your return at an exponential rate. Yeah, well, that's all fine in theory. But at the end of the day, again, there's any number of innovations that have the potential to generate incredible revenues, but it's just the business and operating model doesn't necessarily mean that they can reduce fixed costs and put everything on balance on the variable side of their income statement. I would put it back to you and say that some of the investors out there who make those observations are maybe the kind of investors who don't necessarily have the funds or the means or the experience to invest in bigger, riskier ventures that do require a lot of cash expenditure upfront and represent a little bit more fixed costs and a little bit more risk up front. So it kind of all goes back to what kind of investor are you talking to? There's some investors who only have a few $1 million to play with. There's other investors who are managing funds that are worth hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars. So if you're talking to an investor who's got $1 billion to play with, or managing a fund that represents $1 billion, that conversation is going to look very different. I'll use as one last example, Miguel. I mean, we talk about the drug manufacturing industry, right? There's an example where there's incredible amounts of money made off the pharmaceutical industry, but typically the runway for that is a minimum 10 years to get a product fully tested and approved for commercial use, right? Well, that's a lot of fixed, or let's call it sunk cost up front. But on the other hand, there's a lot of investors out there that specialize. They have the means to invest in that. They specialize in pharmaceutical product. And if you come to me one day and tell me, I think I've got the cure for cancer, it's going to take 10 or 12 years to get it to market. Well, there's going to be people out there who are willing to spend the money to make that happen. So it's all very much relative. And one of the things I would say to you as an entrepreneur is whenever you're having a conversation with an investor, do your homework on that investor. Because there are all sorts of different investors out there. Some have lots of money, some don't. Some invest in software, some invest in physical device, some invest in B2B solutions, some invest in B2C solutions. And each of those investors becomes a bit of an expert in their own market and their own space. So make sure you're talking to the investors that understand what it is you're doing. And they call it smart money. You're not just looking for money, you're looking for the people behind that money who are kind of smart in the sense that they understand and get what it is you're trying to do. And as a result, they're going to kind of have the patience and they're going to have the advice and be able to mentor you in a way that's really going to help you out.
Yeah, oftentimes you see in Shark Tank, for example, that the founders of these companies, they only go there to get the money, right? They just want to have someone in the team to go to actually invest. But one thing that I have realized, I mean, I have seen founders that ignore all the sharks except for one, and then they go for Mark Cuban, for example, and then the other sharks are like giving them offers, and then they are like respectfully declining, and they're like no, and they're just waiting for Mark Cuban to say something, and then it is because their business fits Mark Cuban's business, right? I mean, it's a technical business, probably IT or something. So usually, I think the same way you target your customers, you need to target your investors. and your employees?
100%. Well, and yeah, and again, let's go back to your experiences with Lumenwire. And of course, again, I had the privilege of mentoring Lumenwire for a couple of years while they were at SFU Venture Connection. And again, it was the same with, I know there were a number of times where they were pitching at certain angel forums here in Vancouver. And quite often, there'd be a room of, say, 20 investors in the room. Well, 18 of them didn't even fully understand what it was they were doing. They didn't appreciate the scale and opportunity that was being represented by Lumenwire. They didn't understand the business model. They just didn't believe. But at the end of the day, I can remember of one situation where they walked away and they had the business cards of one or two investors who, quote unquote, got it. Because one of the investors actually kind of came from the community they were trying to serve. And I would call that a success. I mean, you're generating lead, just as a B2B sales representative is looking to generate and qualify leads to sell a product. You're doing the exact same thing when you're looking for investors. It's just, you're not selling a product, you're selling your company. But it's the same thing. You need to pre-qualify your investors. And in that particular case, out of a room full of, say, 20 investors, they only found two really that kind of got what it is they were doing and were willing to have a conversation. But 2 out of 20, that's 1 out of 10. Well, look, that in the world of outbound selling, that's about the ratio. You're pretty happy if you're hitting a 1 in 10 ratio when you're doing outbound calling and targeting suspect leads. It's just the numbers. It's the rule of the numbers, right? It's just a numbers game.
Yeah, and I mean the numbers game is the thing that rules everything. I mean, you want to make sure that you understand what are your odds of getting an investor and also of getting people to consume on your regular business. And one of the things that I think we need to talk about now that we're discussing the financials in the beginning, there's this state of survival that founders need to be able to understand. And we touched a little bit on this earlier. You need to make sure that everybody in your team can pay rent, they can pay groceries, and obviously, have a decent salary to be happy at the moment. So there is, that's one aspect of it, but then there is this other survival state, right? You need to keep improving upon your services, especially if you're a SaaS company. You need to keep improving because you probably will have a agile system where you're just improving and hearing feedback and everything. I have met quite a few investors who start to listen to feedback very well at an early stage, and then for some reason, I think it may be because of cost constraints, they stop listening, and then they just try to finish the product as it is, and then they get stagnated, I think, and then they're unable to jump the chasm, to cross the chasm. What is that a common thing, or has that been just my luck that I have seen in the past couple of years?
Well, that's a bit of a big question, Miguel. I mean, because at the end of the day, every startup, every founder, every founding team, each journey is going to be a little bit different and a little bit unique. I think what the important lesson always is that you need, when you set out on a journey, it's about understanding the destination. But then also recognizing that over the course of the journey, you may end up needing to take a detour or two. And as cliched as that is, that's precisely what happens when you set out to not only bring an innovation to market, but to build a company, right? Because there's two things going on. You're building a product or innovation, but you're also building a company around that product. And your sales reps are selling the product, but potentially you as the founder, maybe one day selling the company, right? So first off, those two things are happening in tandem. But then what I always try to do, especially when I'm coaching first-time early stage entrepreneurs and founders, is say, look, what you need to be mindful of is that each and every startup goes on its own unique journey, but there are some basic milestones that every startup needs to achieve in order to succeed and quote unquote make it, whatever that is. And the first one is, number one, have you truly found the right product market fit? And have you identified that there is a very large addressable market that you have an ability to directly approach and attain customers? That's number one. Number two, once you've built out your minimum viable product, I mean, are you getting a sense of what a repeatable sales and marketing engine look like? Have you gone through, after customer discovery and after evolving your product? I often say, as a sales and marketing guy, the next thing you need to do is make sure that you have you've gone through tactical discovery. And by that, I mean, you figured out that combination of sales and marketing activities that is generating repeatable sales, right? So that's milestone number two. Milestone number one, product market fit. Milestone number two, building towards a repeatable revenue engine. Then we're getting into the big milestones. The first one we've talked about, how much volume, once you have that repeatable engine in place, how much volume do you need to achieve just to be self-sustaining, right? Because as much as we're passionate about our business and our innovation, passion doesn't feed the stomach. Passion does not put a roof over your head, right? You need some cash to survive as individuals, not just as a company. Once you've hit that milestone, then really what you're talking about is your growth trajectory. Have you been modeling out what growth looks like for you? And why, this may sound sort of silly, but when you put a growth rate to your financial model and your financial projection, why precisely are you choosing a particular growth rate? Because the question for you is, are you looking to build a company that you could be potentially holding on to for 10 years and you want to become the dominant player in the market? Well, then your growth rate over 5 years may be pegged to a destination that is to become, to capture 35 or 40% of the market, because that then makes you the leader and then may put you in a position to acquire other companies, and so forth and so on. So then your growth rates and your growth trajectory is pegged to becoming the number one in the market and a dominant player, right? But on the other hand, your exit strategy may be about getting acquired by somebody else. You may recognize that there's another dominant player out there that you're never really gonna, you don't think, have a chance to surpass. And if anything, the story may be very different. It may be that you recognize you've got a very specialized product or innovation that dominant player out there may be interested in acquiring off you at some point in time. In which case, your growth story may be simply about demonstrating an incredibly rapid rate of adoption by one or more markets. So then what you're talking about, your growth multiple, is talking about, well, what are you trying to demonstrate in the next 3 or 4 years? That you're doubling or tripling your customer base year over year for 3 years in a row. If you are able to demonstrate that on the books, that's going to get the attention of some people who may look at you and say, wait a minute, they've just built something that's really taken off like a rocket. Does that product or innovation fit into our larger portfolio of offerings? Maybe we should be acquiring them. And so I'm speaking of like the Microsofts of the world or the Googles of the world, that go out and acquire smaller, very fast growing startups. But Miguel, I guess it all goes back to sort of saying, well, first off, what's your end game? And is your end game to become, it's really kind of boils down to two things. Either you want to become number one in the industry and you want to become the next Microsoft or the next Google in the vastest of wildest dreams, or you want to build something that is so compelling and so fast growing that somebody else picks you up. It's usually one or the other of those two. Once you figure out what that is, then your growth story and everything you're trying to mobilize in terms of resources and cash is about hitting the growth metrics that will enable you to achieve either 40% market dominance or a growth multiple that is so fast and so compelling in such a short period of time that somebody comes along and acquires you. As long as you're mindful of that as the end game, then basically everything else that you're doing is trying to drive you towards, one of those two scenarios.
So so that makes a lot of sense. And when one thing that I wanted to kind of touch on now that we're talking about like a little bit about the investors and also the growth strategies or like the milestones that you need to touch on. A lot of people are looking for investors not necessarily for their investment, but they're looking merely because of their knowledge on the industry or their experience. So, um, how, yeah, I think a lot of people are trying to get investors who will mentor them more than just invest in them, and maybe because of that they may give a really cheap price to the investor at the moment, or a cheap valuation, just so that they can get him, right? So how should people go about it when they need a mentor and when they know that this person will certainly be a mentor, but then they cannot, they don't really know how to go about it? Like, how difficult is it to get like a counselor or a coach in as an entrepreneur?
It's another really good question. And actually, as you asked me that question, here's what I would put to you, because you mentioned mentor and coach in the same breath as you mentioned investor. And I think what I'd like to do for this particular question is actually split those two to begin with. And I'd say, as an entrepreneur, especially if you're a first-time entrepreneur or founder, the very first thing you want to do are find mentors and coaches that have no vested interest in your business whatsoever. These are individuals who you can trust, ideally individuals who have had the experience and are, a few steps ahead of you in their professional development and their entrepreneurial development. And the reason why is because there are going to be situations as a founder and entrepreneur where you need frank, impartial advice about either a strategic aspect of your operation or a tactical aspect of your operation. And you want to be able to get candid, straight advice from them without it being clouded by money or cash whatsoever. And so the question then would be, well, where do you find those people? Well, I mean, Miguel, you found me through SFU Venture Connection, which is an incubator here in town, in Vancouver. And of course, our sister organization is SFU Venture Labs, which is an accelerator for more mature, fast developing startups. That's certainly one place that you'd want to go to, would be just try to identify incubators and accelerators in town. Almost all of them have a small complement of entrepreneurs and residents, mentors, business coaches of one kind or another. And these are people who usually come with a breadth of experience. They have some subject matter expertise. They might be a sales specialist, a marketing specialist, or finance specialist, but they both also often had some direct experience in being part of a startup. And these are people who, they want to give back. I want to give back to the community, and I do that through these incubators and accelerators. And I can sit down and have some very frank, impartial advice with you on any number of subjects, from fundraising through sales, marketing, operations. That's the first place you want to look at. The second one is just talk to fellow entrepreneurs. And I mean, in every community, there's usually either social networking opportunities where you can just connect with other entrepreneurs and sort of get their advice and feedback. The academic community is the third one. There's a lot of professors out there at SFU, BD School of Business. There's a lot of very seasoned professors. They may be academics, but many of them actually have a business background as well, and may be able to share advice for you, or at the very least share some literature for you. So that's the first thing I think you want to be absolutely certain that you do, is find mentors and advisors who have no vested interest in your business whatsoever, because they're going to give you the straight goods. But then we get into actually finding investors. And again, that goes back to the discussion around what we often call smart money, and try to find those investors out there who they have the money, they're excited about what you're doing. They've got the money to invest in your company, And when I say they've got the money to invest in your money, in your company, one of the things you want to make absolutely certain you understand about this investor is that, not only are they able to cut a check to support your business, but they actually have a significant fund behind them. One of the things you want to look out for as investors is there's a lot of people who get into the investment game who actually can't afford to get into the investment game. And by that, I mean, it's like managing any other portfolio of investments. Truly successful investors of startups are ones who understand that they need to diversify their risk, and they need to hold multiple positions across many different startups, because the reality is quite a few of those positions, they're going to fail. They're not going to make money off it. And so as a result, they have an extensive portfolio. And in order to have an extensive portfolio, it means you need, at the very least, depending on how much each position represents for you, if you're cutting checks for $25,000 or $50,000, then I would want to see you be behind a fund that's at least in the low tens of millions. If you're cutting checks that are in the six-figure range, then it would be great if you've got, maybe the low hundreds of millions of dollars behind you. And the reason why I say that is because you, as the entrepreneur, will get an idea of how many positions they can afford to hold. And as a result, how diversified their overall portfolio is. If they don't have a diversified portfolio, if it turns out they invest in you and you're only one of 5 companies they've invested in, because that's all they can afford. Well, Miguel, you can probably guess where this is going to go. They're going to start to panic, because if it turns out all 5 of the startups they've invested in are not doing that well, they haven't properly diversified their risk. And then they're going to start getting into very hard conversations with you as a founder with your startup, because they're going to be asking you about time to execution. Why is it taking so long to get the next version of your product to market? Let's start taking some shortcuts here and there. Let's start to do other things that are compromising your operations and finance. So it goes back to our earlier conversation about, it's really important for an entrepreneur to properly vet and qualify the investor. Does the investor actually have the kind of money that's required to invest in a startup? Are they willing to lose that money? I mean, basically outright, if they even cut a check for as small as $25,000 or $50,000 as an angel investor for an early stage startup, can they truly afford to and be willing to completely lose all that money? Because it may very well happen, right? That's number one. And then number two, if they're getting into it at that level of risk, then do they actually understand your business? Have they invested in your kind of solution or market before? Have they been a founder themselves? Do they understand the pressures that you're going to be under as an entrepreneur and founder? So it's far more than just looking for somebody who can cut you a check for $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000. There's a lot more homework that needs to be done in order for you to find that right mix.
So what do you think then about the people who get as their first investors, their family and friends? I mean, I think that can lead to very awkward conversations too. Maybe some very unpleasant dinners as well in Christmas.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, they always joke it's family, friends, and fools, right? And again, if you're, and it's very common, by the way, and it's perfectly legit for you to raise your first, it might even be as little as $50,000, in small increments of 5,000 or 10,000 here and there between relatives and friends. And you just need that initial amount of money to kind of, I always joke, buy yourself ramen and Red Bull, pay for a couple of software contractors and just get that first prototype up and running so you can demonstrate it. Whatever it may be. Yeah. I mean, again, it goes back to the fact that you want to have a very frank dialogue with those family members and friends to say, look, I really appreciate the fact that you have faith in me and you're willing to cut a check for $5,000, but are you absolutely certain that you can lose all $5,000? Because this right now is at the highest point of risk that any startup can ever be. This could completely collapse in a matter of 3 months, and we all need to walk away from this. So if you're giving me $5,000, are you willing to walk away from that money today, and make the commitment and take the risk? And so again, it goes back to asking whether these people can genuinely afford the $5,000. If you have a grandmother who's got $5 million stowed away, and she lives in a small apartment and has very little appetites, well, $5,000 is probably not a lot to ask. But if your grandmother's a pensioner, and as much as she loves you, Miguel, $5,000 represents 3 months worth of her allowance. Yeah, I don't think you want to be talking to your grandmother about that. So
Yeah, definitely not. And that's one of the very important questions, I think, because I know, some people have a hard time saying no, especially to their friends and family, and that's where a lot of awkward conversations start, and like, it almost feels like you're asking for free money, right? Because I know a lot of, there's Kevin O'Leary, he was talking about people asking him for like investment in his personal circle, like his friends and family, and he was like, look, I'm gonna give you $200,000, what you ask me or whatever, but you're not allowed to ask me again, right? And you don't need to pay it back, basically. It's a gift, and that's it. So I think once you're that rich, you'll get a lot of these so-called pitches for companies, and a lot of them are obviously going to be unsuccessful. And the only way that you can keep, yourself at peace is just doing it one time, but make sure that you're frank. I'm not going to do it again. So this is your time. But for most of us that are not like multi-millionaires, I think it is really hard to just put $5,000. I mean, if you ask me, can you put $5,000 in this business that may fail in 5 months? I'll feel like probably not. I won't be able to put that money.
Well, and you know what? Again, Miguel, it kind of goes all the way back to the very first a couple of questions we went through in the beginning of our conversation, which was all the way back to customer discovery and market product fit, and testing that innovation in the beginning, and knowing that you're getting sucked up in a tornado. The more confident you are in the beginning that you have something that really could lift off, and the more quickly you begin to validate that, even if it's through a series of sort of pilot partners and anchor clients who are, they may be not paying full market rate, but you're realizing wow, they're willing to pay money pretty quick for what it is I've got, and it's only even half built, right? Those are situations where you've only got so many data points to work with, but your guts and your instinct are telling you that, geez, there could be something here. Like I've only kind of put not half effort into it, but I've only even just sort of accomplished half of what I need to do from a validation perspective, and I'm already generating some pretty extraordinary interest. Well, if you think about it, Miguel, I mean, again, what you're doing when you're going out and raising money is you're selling your company, and you're selling not just the product, you're selling the fact that you can build a company around this product that could be generating millions of dollars within a matter of 3-4 years. Well, if you're seeing that level of validation in the beginning, which is really, to be frank, what you're looking for, then the reality is that there are investors out there who do have lots of money. And so as soon as they see an exciting story, that's what they're looking for, right? I'm not necessarily saying that you can walk into a fund that's worth $100 million and be able to sell them right away. But what I am telling you is that investors are running a business model like every other business, and they're looking for leads, and their leads are early stage startups. And the fact of the matter is, they have to sift through a lot of startups in order to find what they would call a promising, qualified early stage startup. If you've done your homework and you've done the right amount of customer discovery, and you're starting to validate at an early stage an opportunity to really turn this into something, well, then those people with the bigger checkbooks are going to get sort of excited about that pretty quick. And so as a result, you may not, if you're lucky, you may not need to be asking for checks of 5,000 and 10,000 from your grandmother. You can kind of jump into the bigger money pretty quick, because they're going to want to support you. These more affluent investors are going to want to try to support you and drive this as quickly as possible so that everybody can get a return.
Yeah, another way of getting funding, and this is possibly, especially for small startups, the best option to get funding. And I think this is by getting government grants and also joining a venture lab, venture connection, venture labs, like a venture, how do you call this? Like an accelerator, like an accelerator. Yeah. So like, how does that work? How do accelerators and the government grants and organizations help startups, launch?
Well, there are lots of different accelerator models out there in North America, and I'm most familiar with North America. In some instances, the accelerator, first and foremost, again, accelerators typically offer coaching and mentorship, which should never be undervalued, because typically, especially when companies start to get to that point where they need to scale, there's a lot of complex business challenges that founding teams need to work through. What does it take to scale your physical operation? What does it take to scale and grow your sales engine? Raising money again. It's one thing to be raising $200, $300, $500,000, but when you get to a point where you are starting to really see that rapid accelerating opportunity and growth, well, now you need to start raising $1 million, $2 million, $5 million or more. And those conversations start getting a little bit more complex. The documentation, the financial modeling, the legal implications tend to get a little bit more dense. And so it's great when you have an army of mentors and coaches that can help walk you through what's required to navigate that part of your growth as a startup. And again, the best place to go is find an accelerator or an incubator. Often there's a membership fee associated with it, but I can tell you in most instances, the membership fee is well worth the market rate of the consulting and coaching that you're going to get. So that's step number one. Step number two, most accelerators and incubators also provide programming of one kind or another, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour workshops and information sessions on any given topic, especially changing best practices around things like, how to sell and market for a B2B product in the 21st century. There's new technologies, new platforms, new practices and tactics constantly on the move. And so accelerators and incubators probably try to do their best to provide programming to kind of catch you up to speed. And then some accelerators either have a fund behind them. Not all, but some accelerators have a fund. And in fact, in some cases, to be admitted into the accelerator, part of the commitment is that the accelerator basically invests in you and will actually, provide you a certain amount of funding, whatever that may be. It might be 50,000, it might be 100,000 or 25,000, and they effectively invest in you and have a small percentage of the company. But not only they're providing you expertise and also potentially a roof over your head. In many cases, you're actually provided a small amount of office space at a subsidized rate, but they are in effect an investor in you. If, on the other hand, the accelerator does not have a fund, there's two other ways in which accelerators may be able to help you find money. Many accelerators are actually affiliated with an angel fund or angel group of some kind. So as an example, here in Vancouver at SFU Venture Labs, there's a very strong strategic partnership between SFU Venture Labs and Vantech. Vantech is one of the more active angel groups in the Vancouver area. And so where SFU Venture Labs in and of itself does not have a fund, it kind of serves as a vetting ground for Vantech. If SFU Venture Labs, and we're constantly dealing with applicants all the time. Well, ultimately those applicants that we feel are suitable for the accelerator, that immediately becomes a bit of a pre-qualification for the members of Vantech to start looking at this company as well. So you sort of, accelerators often serve as a bit of an endorsement. The last thing you can look for with accelerators, not all do it, but some of them do, is they will put on annual contests or even quarterly contests, pitch events that are often sponsored, and there's prize money behind it. And the prize money may be, 25,000 or 100,000, or I believe it's Waterloo in Ontario. There's an accelerator, I believe, associated with Waterloo that has $1 million prize. It's once a year, last I checked, but the prize money, the grand purse is for $1 million. So those are a few different ways in which accelerators provide you not only expertise in programming, but potentially subsidized rent if you're at that stage where you don't necessarily want to go out into the commercial leasing market quite yet. And then directly or indirectly, they can be a source of funding as well.
That's great. I knew about a little bit about accelerators because I was with you guys in Venture Connections, but I didn't really get to feel the entire experience since I didn't begin with Lumenwire at the stage of applying and everything. Right now, last question I wanted to ask you, and this is a question I ask every guest, in order to get some really interesting insight from you guys. And this I often don't prepare you for this because I wanna get you just out of your comfort zone a little bit. So give us 5 pieces of advice that you will give yourself when you were 18 years old.
That's good. Well, I think the first one is the absolute very first one is that time runs out in a hurry, and there's one currency you can never buy back, which is time. And so every waking hour that you have in a day, do your absolute best to take full advantage of your time, especially if you're healthy and you're in a situation in life where you have a bit of a luxury to pursue some education and pursue a passion. Don't waste the hours in the day, because as cliched as it is, they start to disappear after a while. The older you get, the faster times move and sand goes through the hourglass. So even at a young age, I would look at, I had a lot of fun, and I've had a pretty active and entertaining career so far. But there's definitely some hours and some afternoons that, I probably misspent that could have been, better used to create, cultivate, and contribute. So that'd be number one. Number two, and this is something I actively do, but I would tell everybody, is life is about constant learning, non-stop. And it's not only, and however you may do that, whether it's through podcasts like this, whether it's reading books, whether it's popping on a YouTube video, but not only are you, I guess what I would say, and this kind of ties into item number 3, not only should you be constantly feeding your brain with, as many things as you possibly can. The third thing I would say is, in the beginning in life, it's often about finding something to specialize in. Usually you need to make your mark, and usually you need to start by finding something that gets you really excited and then getting really, really good at it and specializing. But here's the trick. You also, if you want to be a leader in life, no matter what that position may be, whether it's as an entrepreneur and founder, or whether maybe you just want to pursue a senior position in an established organization, or maybe it's a not-for-profit or a charity or what have you. I always say to people, specialists are often responsible for building innovation, but generalists are responsible for building and managing companies. And that's a really tough transition for a lot of people. And it usually, if you want to be serious about being a successful leader in life, that transition really needs to begin in about the middle of your career, typically, let's say in your late 30s, early 40s, if not earlier. but you need to begin to train and equip yourself to understand what it takes to operate and think as a generalist. And by generalist, I mean like literally a general manager, or even as in a military general. And the reason why I say this again is because specialists focus all of their time and effort and education and learning on going deep on something, on really understanding every layer of something so they become an absolute expert. And again, usually great innovation comes out of that. But in order to lead, and this kind of goes back to our earlier comment about true success is about understanding human beings, not understanding tools, technology, and things in the world. And that really is about being a generalist. It's really about stepping back for a second and kind of understanding the larger world context, and really focusing on things like history and culture and people and teams, and how people and teams will work differently, and language, and how each and every day we all use different languages. And I don't just mean, Farsi versus French versus Spanish versus English. I mean literally the language of a software coder is going to be very different from the language of a digital marketer or a CPA, an accountant. And so if you want to assume a leadership role, then you need to be kind of mindful that at some point I need to be capable and be able to speak to a breadth of topics, with a breadth of people who may speak very different languages and look at things from very different perspectives. So that's item number one. So item number three. So number one, really be mindful of your time. And be as productive as you can and as effective with your time as possible. Number two, always be in a state of learning. Number three, that means then that, especially when you transition into a leadership role, if you've become really excellent at something as a specialist, at some point you need to think more broadly as a generalist, which then we'll get on to, I think, point number four, which is the best way to tackle fear is to address it dead on. And by that I mean, and I'll borrow from another great work that I recommend. I recommend anyone read this work, but especially if you're an entrepreneur and founder. Miguel, you and I have talked about this man before. Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut, who wrote a book called An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. And in chapter 6, which is probably my favorite chapter's entitled, What's the Next Thing That Could Kill Me? And he literally talks about his journey in outer space and his journey training to be an astronaut. Is once you get yourself up there, whether it's the International Space Station or maybe one day a journey back to the moon, I mean, you are in the most challenging, most dangerous environment that you could possibly put yourself in as a human being. That or potentially being 2 miles under the ocean. And so you are in a constant state of risk and danger, which means you need to be aware of all the different things that could potentially happen to you, and then begin to think through what are the different ways to prepare for it and to mitigate it. Well, what he learned very quickly is that the best way to manage the anxiety and the fear around all of that is to address each one of those dangers and risks dead on and become knowledgeable about what it actually represents for you. And with knowledge comes a sense of confidence, right? The fear is always going to be there, but you're going to be able to manage that fear and anxiety a little bit better when you tackle it dead on. So Miguel, what does that mean for the average person waking up? As I'd say, especially as a leader, when you wake up every day, we all have those one or two things right now that are intimidating us. There's always those one or two things that we know we need to tackle, and we don't actually know a lot about it. And as a result, we're kind of avoiding it. We're being intimidated by it a little bit. And the sooner you can train yourself to make that the first thing you do in the day is to do something to get your head wrapped around it and to address it dead on, the more effective you're going to be, the more confident you're going to be. And of course, the irony is, again, as Chris Hadfield says, the sooner you become informed about something, the sooner you develop knowledge about something, the fear and the anxiety sort of gradually moves to the back of your brain. So that's a muscle and a practice and a habit you need to develop in life, whether a leader or otherwise. So that'd be the fourth point is, going from specialist to generalist, which then means, well, What do I need to learn and develop? The fifth and final one, what would be, I think, Miguel, it would be, um, do whatever it takes in life to maintain perspective about what's actually really important. And part of that is about allowing yourself to take a break. And I see it most especially with entrepreneurs and founders is naturally enough, you're going to get lost in your business and you're going to be working 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. And that's going to lead to an incredible amount of stress and fatigue and probably poor health, bad diet. And when you're younger, when you're in your 20s, maybe early 30s, you can do a heck of a lot to your body and your system and still push through it. But eventually that's going to catch up to you. Right. And certainly as you get older, I mean, you've got a lot, we all have lots to offer in our later 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 60s. But you got to be good to yourself, which means, as cliched as it is, you got to make sure you're giving yourself a decent amount of sleep. You got to make sure you got some sort of a healthy diet and a bit of exercise. But the biggest one, again, is about perspective. And it's about allow yourself to take your moments to get away from it all and find those things that center you and that kind of recharge your batteries. And that could be anything from playing a team sport. You may enjoy music and you may have an instrument, give yourself that hour to learn a new song on your guitar or the piano, whatever it is. I love art. I sketch. I love to draw. And I love to make sure that I have a few hours in the week that I put on a little music and I sit down with my sketch pad and pencil and just lose myself in art. Whatever the craft may be, or just go for a walk, go for a hike, if you enjoy nature. You've got to do that for yourself because it recharges you. I always say it sets your brain straight. It's amazing after you've gone for a 1 hour hike and lost yourself in nature, that problem that you've been chewing on for the last week that's been bugging the crap out of you, it's amazing where all of a sudden the solutions start hitting you right away if you allow your brain an opportunity to just kick back and relax for a minute. So that would be the fifth and final one. It is give yourself a break from time to time and kind of step back and smell the roses and realize there's a lot more to life, including your family and your loved ones. There's a lot more to life than just trying to make money and trying to make your startup a success. If you lose that perspective, it's kind of all for nothing. You'll end up being a pretty tired and fatigued person, I think.
Yeah, I think I heard Conor McGregor once said that he's not looking for more money; he's just looking for inner peace.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and that speaks volumes, right? Because he has a lot of
Yeah.
money, but he doesn't want the money. He just wants inner peace. And I think that's something that we often forget about. You don't really want the money. You want the peace. Actually, yesterday while I was walking, I had this realization that we don't need the money. I mean, the reason why we think money makes us happy is because every time, the more money we have, the more dopamine shots that we can get in our brain by buying things.
Yeah.
And that's just like you're addicted to that dopamine shot. But in reality, what makes you really happy is to feel successful in the way that you define it, right? Whether success means having a prosperous family, whether success means to be able to help your community, but that inner peace that comes with that meaning of success is irreplaceable by money.
You're absolutely right. The mad race for cash, and we all often do it. I certainly was guilty of this in the beginning, where there was a lot of focus on my career and advancing myself through the organization, and getting a bigger and better title and getting a bigger and better salary, and and then you start to realize that's an empty way to live your life. And there's a point at which the moment you step back and realize, you know what, it's kind of like survival state. And to be honest with you, Miguel, I didn't, now that I think about it, it kind of clicked in for me when I started to get more and more involved in the world of startups. And when I was directly involved in a startup myself, I started to realize that it kind of really is all about survival state. Life is about survival state. For Chris Hadfield in outer space, it's about survival state. You're on a mission. Absolutely. There's a journey, there's a destination. But if you can wake up every day in the morning and start off by saying, am I healthy? Do I have a roof over my head, food in the fridge? Am I able to pay for the rent? And am I surrounded by some loved ones? Um, that's kind of it. From the day you're born to the day you die, like that's really it. And whether you've got a fast car in the driveway, or a second cabin in the woods, or a boat on the water, we all have our toys and our kind of desires. But especially when we go through this really challenging time with COVID and the pandemic, and we started to see, so many lives being lost, and each of us, I'm sure, have our family members that we worry are at risk. I mean, one of the things that a situation like this pandemic does do for us, it certainly did for me, is to step back again and say, well, look, like, there's a lot going on, but at the end of the day, I'm pretty grateful for the fact that I live in a great country. I've got my basic needs taken care of. I'm surrounded by some loving family and friends. I've got food in the fridge. I don't actually have a lot to complain about. I'm living a sustainable. I'm in survival state. I'm living a sustainable life. After that, it goes back to what I said earlier: is when you've got that, then you step back and say, I've got 16, 18 hours in a day. What am I doing with that time? And I think I'd probably close out, Miguel, by saying we kind of have a choice. We can either consume, which is what a lot of us do, especially in North America. It's all about consuming and feeding our appetites. Or I often say, and I say this to my daughter, I say, there's other things you could be thinking about. You could either be creating with your hands, you could be cultivating your mind, or you could be contributing to your community. And I try to do that, and I certainly try to get my daughter to think about that. Is every waking hour of the day, you're either consuming, and we all know where that eventually is going to take our planet if we consume in great volume without keeping our appetites in check, or we could be thinking about what each of us could do as an individual to create, cultivate, and contribute. And I would hope that if each of us sort of take some time every morning to think about what we're doing with those hours, and are we creating, cultivating, and contributing, then I think we're going to be building a better and better world around us.
I completely agree. And with this, we wrap up this podcast. Thank you so much for all the time that you put into this interview and also the preparation that came into it. And I really appreciate talking to you. Hopefully, you'll come back to the podcast again, and we can keep discussing the plenty of material that there is to discuss about startups and funders and investors. Thank you so much, Chris. Any last words do you want to say?
I was just going to say, Miguel, thanks so much. It was great to be here, and I hope your listeners benefited from some of what was discussed. And absolutely, love to come back another time if you think there's some new topics you'd like to run through, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right. So thank you to all the listeners. You can find us in YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Spotify. And hopefully we're moving to new platforms coming, but that will be announced later. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.